Alright, so today I want to give you 10 tips on how you can build more confidence working with your pet snake. Now let me tell you, from the very beginning, I pretty much had an advantage over most people. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I was in the boonies in Wisconsin. Out in the middle of nowhere, we were actually catching garter snakes and bringing them home to show the family. It was kind of interesting. Quite a few times, I'd actually bring back a garter snake. I had blood dripping down my arm from the bites. And let me tell you, from a very early age, I was not afraid to take a bite from a snake. And I think most people are really not like that. Most people are really intimidated by snakes. I know a lot of people have different degrees of fear when it comes to snakes. And you might be watching my channel thinking, hey, maybe I should get a snake. They look pretty harmless, and then you actually get one and everything can change when you actually get that snake and bring it into your house. It can be a little more intimidating than you think. And it's kind of interesting. I actually picked up a free snake on Craigslist once, and I went into this house and it was like a husband and wife and like 3 or 4 kids running around, and they had this ball python they were giving away. I actually got one of my first free snakes off of Craigslist, and they had it in this glass aquarium with some kind of a substrate, and the ball python was all balled up on the bottom of the tank. And I came into that house, and the first thing I did is I walked over, reached down and picked up that ball python, and everybody's eyes got really wide, and they're like, I can't believe you just picked up that snake. Let me tell you, they had no confidence picking up a snake like that. So in this video, if you're kind of in between kind of maybe an extreme fear and really being really comfortable with snakes, everyone falls in there somewhere. I want to give you some tips on how you can build confidence with your snake. Alright, so the number one thing that really helped me the most when I first started out in my reptile career, and that was watching YouTube videos. And I would say you kind of learn by experience just by watching people. It's kind of interesting watching some of these big snake breeders go in and work with the snakes, and watch someone who really has a lot of confidence going in and picking up the snake and just kind of handling them and kind of whipping them around, and you're like, hey, I think I can do that. It's kind of interesting. Versus if you never watched anybody and you just went in to pick up the snake, it could be pretty intimidating. I'd say probably 99% of my confidence early on, especially working with a huge variety of small and large snakes, came from a lot of these professional breeders from YouTube videos. Alright, so the number 2 thing that you really should work on when you're first getting into snakes, and that is learning how to read snakes, how to read the behavior, and how to read kind of what mode they're in. So for example, the snake around my neck here, this is Bobby, my bamboo ball python. He is in a handling mode right now, and it's funny, once you get a ball python in handling mode, they are super friendly and super tame. It's pretty hard to get them into an aggressive mode or a feeding mode or anything like that. If you kind of know the different modes, how to read the snake, how to figure out what kind of a mood they're in. Sometimes when you first open the tub and they pop their head out, they're definitely in a feeding mode, and you have to be really careful not to get bit. If you can actually learn to read your snake really well, I think it helps to build confidence with your snake. Okay, so the third thing you can do to really help you build confidence with your snake, and that is you can wear some gloves. And I actually have some gloves here. These are just my old gloves from throwing hay to my cows. And the funny thing about gloves is, the thing you're really worried about is the bite. So if you actually handle a snake with gloves, you'll actually avoid taking a bite. And if you take a bite in the glove, it doesn't hurt at all because it's essentially biting on leather. So it's almost like a foolproof way to handle a snake without really taking a bite. The problem is, I found, is that if you're handling a snake with gloves, especially a bigger snake, they become really super slippery, and it seems like you can really get a better grasp on the snake if you're not wearing gloves, and it's really difficult. I would say I kind of started out with some of my big snakes with gloves, and I found out it was a really bad idea because the snake was just really super slippery, and I really couldn't get a handle on the snake. As a matter of fact, when I'm handling big snakes, I take off my watch, I pull the phone out of my back pocket, and kind of take all the obstacles out of the way, because it seems like all those little things kind of get in the way, especially with gloves. And once you build confidence, I'd say don't be afraid to wear gloves. If you're starting out and you're just getting used to your snake, it's okay to wear gloves, but I'd say in a short time you'll probably lose those gloves just so you can get a better handle on your snake. And then one of the things about gloves too is when I'm I'm feeding really big snakes, especially if I'm feeding by hand instead of with tongs. I definitely use gloves because I don't want to take a bite from one of my big reticulated pythons. I actually still wear gloves to this day, only when feeding my really big retics. All right, so the number 4 tip on how to build confidence with your snake, and that is to use a snake hook. And let me tell you, a snake hook can be really invaluable, especially if you have some really big snakes. I actually picked one of these up. This is actually a really big one. I really like this one because I can come up to my really big reticulated pythons and kind of move the head away and then come around the back to kind of deflect the head, make sure I'm not going to take a bite from that snake. And a lot of times it just takes just a few seconds with the snake hook to kind of figure out how to read the snake, what mode he's in. And a lot of times if they come out in a really severe aggressive feeding mode, I'm really glad I have the hook and I can kind of deflect them and try to get them back into the tub if they start coming out. Sometimes it can get pretty crazy, but I'd say even if you're starting out with really small snakes and you're really not confident with that snake, a snake hook can really come in handy to kind of deflect the head away, and then you can come around the back to pick up that snake. All right, so tip number 5 for confidence with snakes, and that is you can actually lose your confidence as the snake grows larger and larger. And this has actually happened to me with my reticulated pythons. Essentially, both of them, I bought them as hatchlings. They were really small, and it seemed like every time I handled them, they were a completely different snake because they grew so fast, so quick. And within 4 years, Lucy got up to, she's probably about 100 pounds now. She's pretty amazing. I'm actually breeding her this year, and she's developing eggs. I'm thinking those eggs developing inside as they grow bigger, she's probably going to get close to 100 pounds. She's a really big girl. The last time I weighed her, she was, I think, almost 90 pounds and 17 feet long. And it seemed like there was certain stages all through her growth as she was growing bigger and bigger, where I'd pick her up and then she was like 5 pounds heavier. And then like a month later, I'd pick her up again and she's 5 pounds heavier. And then before I knew it, it's, you know, she's 20 or 30 pounds heavier, and you're dealing with a completely different animal, and you have to build your confidence all over again with that snake. It's pretty amazing. All right, so tip number 6 is don't fear the bite. And I'd say that is probably one of the hardest things to overcome. Even experienced snake keepers, if you actually have a snake that starts taking bites at you, kind of really aggressive or defensive, it can really kind of make your heart jump a little bit, especially if it's a pretty big snake. I've seen some, medium-sized snakes, if they start getting really crazy defensive, they can actually kind of freak you out a little bit. But I'd say in most cases, it really helps to watch YouTube videos of people working with the snakes, accidentally taking bites, and then you realize after a while that it's really nothing to fear. Unless you're working with venomous snakes, then it's a whole different ball game. I would definitely not have the confidence working with venomous. Or if you're talking about really large snakes like reticulated pythons or maybe anacondas, let me tell you, if you get bit by one of those, you can actually have some problems where you need stitches and staples and stuff like that. But I'd say most cases with smaller snakes, pet size like ball pythons or king snakes, kind of the average size snakes, I would say don't fear the bite. All right, so for number 7, one thing you have to keep in mind is that confidence takes time and experience. And a lot of times you can do it just by watching other people work with snakes. But I would say really, if you want to overcome your kind of fear and intimidation and build confidence, essentially what you're going to have to do eventually is buy a snake and just start handling it on a regular basis. And eventually, with time and experience, you'll finally overcome that fear and build confidence working with that snake. All right, so number 8 is especially for big snakes, and one of the things you have to keep in mind is you want to have respect but not fear. So for example, this is kind of one of the things that kind of was completely opposite for me. I didn't really have any fear getting into snakes. I started with garter snakes, getting bit all the time, and then once I got my reticulated python, I got to the point where he was big enough to do some serious damage, and I still didn't have the fear or the respect of that snake. snake. And that is the problem, because I didn't realize at the time. I was actually looking back at some of my older feeding videos when he came really close to my hand when I was holding the rodent. And let me tell you, if a big reticulated python gets a hold of your hand, it can do some damage. You definitely want to respect that snake, not necessarily fear it, but you want to make sure that certain sizes of snakes, especially really big ones, you want to make sure that you have the respect of that snake and take all the proper precautions, especially if you're working with large snakes or venomous snakes. You definitely have to have respect. All right, so for number 9, what you really need to do is you need to handle your snake more often to build confidence. And that is really what it comes down to. If you have a snake and you kind of just tuck it away and then just slip a rat in every week and you're not really handling your snake, let me tell you, it doesn't really help to build confidence with that snake. What you really need to do is pull it out of the tub once in a while, you know, handle it, maybe put it around your neck or put it in your lap and just kind of work with that snake. And I would say some people say that you can actually handle a snake too much, but I actually handle Bobby about an hour a day every single day in front of the camera here, and he is not stressed at all. Let me tell you, he is a super friendly snake. So I'd say, you know, within a certain reason, I'd probably limit it to maybe an hour or 2 a day. I wouldn't play with the snake much more than that, but I would say if you're handling him maybe once a month, it's probably not enough. You really need to jump in and handle that snake some more to build confidence. All right, so for number 10, you need to know the personality of the snake. And first and foremost, you need to realize that every single snake has a different personality. Some just do not like people. Some are really skittish. Some are super friendly like Bobby. Like I could take this snake here and give it to you, and you know the personality of this from watching my videos. You know this is the friendliest snake in my entire collection. If I actually gave you this snake, you would have more confidence than if I just handed you some random snake. You didn't know that snake. You didn't know the personality. As a matter of fact, a lot of times when I go into pet stores, you know, I'm looking at snakes and I'm like, will that snake bite me? And really it comes down to what I'm really asking is, do you know the personality of the snake? Is this a snake that tends to bite people, or is it a really super friendly snake like this one? And a lot of times people won't actually know, especially in pet stores, and they're like, oh yeah, that snake won't bite you, and then turn around, that snake will actually take a bite out of you. It's pretty amazing. But I'd say if it's your own personal snakes, most of the time you'll know if it's a friendly snake or if it has some issues. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Doug Barnes asks, where do you put the thermostat probe on your rack system? Do you tape it directly to the heat tape? And that is a very good question. And I would say there's quite a few people that do this a little bit different. I've seen a lot of different approaches. And essentially what it is you have a thermostat that the heat source plugs into, and then you have a temperature probe that measures the temperature of the heat source. And I found in my incubator, I was kind of playing around with this a little bit when I first built my incubator. I have a homemade incubator. And what I did first is I put the heat probe right in the middle of the incubator, and then I had the heat source, the heat tape on the sides of the incubator. So there's a gap between the probe that senses the temperature and the heat source. And the problem is if you don't have it directly on the heat source, what happens is that the heat source will overheat and get really super hot until that probe of the thermostat comes up to temperature. So essentially what you're doing is you have these huge swings in temperature with your heat source that gets really hot, and then once it brings the probe up to temperature, it brings it back down again. So my temperatures were swinging up and down, and to fix that, I actually took the probe and I taped it directly on the heat source and dialed it into a specific temperature. And that's essentially what you need to do, especially in incubators. If you have egg boxes right next to that heat source, the side of the egg box can get really super hot when it's trying to heat to a certain temperature to get the probe in the middle of the incubator up to temperature. And it's kind of the same way with the rack system. I'd pretty much always recommend that you take the heat probe and tape it directly to the heat source, because what's happening is you have a more stable temperature, a really narrow, some of these thermostats can keep less than 1 degree variance in temperature on your heat source, which is pretty awesome, which is pretty much what you want. And then from there, what you want to do is you want to measure some temperatures, and if you don't have enough heat transfer transmission into your tub, you can actually dial up your heat source a little bit so the temperature in your tub is appropriate. But pretty much what I do is I just set all my hotspots to 90 and I just tape my heat probe right to the heat source, which is pretty much like a heat tape, and then I just kind of set it and forget it and don't really worry about my temperatures, and it always seems to work out really well. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.